If you've ever traveled to Florence or even just seen the Italian Renaissance in a history class textbook, then you're probably familiar with the name Medici. That's because the Medici were one of the most powerful families in Renaissance Italy. They produced 4 popes, 2 of which were elected only after the first 2 had died. 2 brothers who became the most successful bankers of their generation. And they were also the patrons of some of the greatest works of art ever made by Michelangelo, Botticelli, and Da Vinci. Today, we'll be looking at the rise of the Medici and their legacy that shaped early modern Europe. When we think of Renaissance Italy, we tend to imagine the merchant class of northern Italy being the dominant economic force. And while they were quite important, especially in Venice, it was really the Medici who dominated the Italian economy throughout the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. The Medici's success began in the late 13th century when a wool trader named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici decided to go into banking. His son Matteo joined him in the business and expanded their operation to a European level. By 1421, Matteo had built up enough capital to loan 70,000 florins to the ruler of Florence for an interest rate of 8%. Now, as far as I can tell, there isn't any record of what happened if you didn't pay back the Medici on time. But I'm guessing that 8% interest rate was not negotiable. Upon his death, Matteo left the bulk of his estate to his oldest son, also named Matteo, and instructed him to give the majority of his wealth to charity. But young Matteo was more interested in spending his father's fortune than giving it away. He went to Rome, bought a noble title, and spent lavishly to gain favor with the Pope. After Matteo's death, the Medici Bank was placed in the hands of his other brothers until their cousin, Cosimo de Medici, came of age. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Unlike his cousins, Cosimo was actually interested in making money. While he was still young, he took charge of the Florentine branch of the family's banking business. At the same time, the Medici had been building up a lot of political influence in Florence by making loans to prominent citizens. When those citizens inevitably fell into debt and couldn't repay the Medici, the bank would foreclose on them and take their property. Cosimo's father-in-law, for example, recently died owing the Medici 500,000 florins, which gave Cosimo control over several lucrative wool-dyeing businesses. While some rivals accused Cosimo of using underhanded tactics to gain his wealth, by 1464, he was the richest man in Florence and could afford to stop working entirely. So that's what he did. This, however, left him bored. So he started buying up vineyards and farms across Tuscany, and he turned his houses in Florence into palaces. But by the end of the 15th century, he had become the unofficial ruler of Florence, without ever holding an official political office. All the while, he remained careful not to incur the displeasure of the Medici rivals, the Albizzi family. And when the head of the Albizzi family was sent to jail for embezzlement, Cosimo used his position to have him released. This gained him the loyalty of the entire Albizzi clan, which gave him the power to manipulate Florence politics behind the scenes. After all, most of the prominent citizens of Florence owed their positions to Cosimo, either through marriage or election. For example, Cosimo helped found the powerful Merchants' Guild, the Arti del Cambio, and secured its first head, a man named Paladi. In turn, Palla used his position to promote Cosimo's agenda, and the two worked together to strip away the power of the old Medici rivals like the Albizzi and the powerful Pazzi family. However, their partnership ended when Palla was accused of raping a nun and fled Florence to escape a certain conviction. Cosimo immediately seized control of Palla's assets, including the orphanage that Palla had founded, and filled it with Cosimo's own illegitimate children. A few years later, Cosimo's greatest rival, Jacopo di Pazzi, tried to overthrow him with the help of 2 assassins. Cosimo uncovered the plot and had both men put to death. Cosimo continued to rule Florence for another 15 years until his death in 1464. During his lifetime, he transformed Florence from a provincial medieval city into the capital of the Italian Renaissance. Cosimo laid the groundwork for this transformation by promoting trade, building public works projects like new roads and aqueducts and founding hospitals, monasteries, and schools. Perhaps most importantly, though, was his patronage of the arts and learning. While wealthy Romans had long supported artists and scholars in their city, Cosimo was the first to do so in Florence. To show off his riches and power, Cosimo hired the most talented architects and artists to decorate his palaces and gardens. He also opened his homes to visiting scholars and artists, some of whom he even employed as teachers to educate his sons. One such scholar was the Greek philosopher George Gemistus Plea, who lived with the Medici for 3 years and tutored Cosimo's sons. After Cosimo's death, Poliziano became the head of the Platonic Academy, a school of philosophy that had been founded by Cosimo's son, Piero. Under Poliziano's direction, the Academy attracted some of the brightest minds in Europe and inspired many of the great thinkers of the Renaissance. It was also during the Medici's reign that Florence saw the construction of its most famous landmark, the Duomo, whose dome was designed by Brunelleschi. Unlike many of the great cathedrals of Europe, the Florence Cathedral was never completed, so it may not be the best example of Renaissance architecture. But it was certainly the most ambitious project of its time and epitomized the spirit of the Renaissance. And so the Medici should get all the credit for funding this massive project. After Cosimo's death, leadership of Florence fell to his son Piero, who didn't share his father's talent for business or politics. As a result, the Medici Bank suffered greatly under his leadership. So Piero decided to make up for his shortcomings by commissioning artworks from the most famous artists of the day. He hired Botticelli to paint several prominent works, including the famous Primavera. Botticelli was actually quite close with the Medici family and even taught Piero's daughter, the infamous Lucretia Tornabuoni, how to draw. But when Piero died in 1492, he left the government of Florence to his son, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Now, despite his nickname, Lorenzo had his share of flaws. He liked to live large, and that caused him to fall into debt. On top of that, he was often irresponsible with his decisions. For example, he once called out all able-bodied men in Florence to prepare to defend the city against an invasion from neighboring Siena. The problem was, he had conveniently forgotten that Florence and Siena were allied. Fortunately, Lorenzo was saved from embarrassment when the bishop of that region intervened and told everyone to chill out. Another problem was the Pazzi family, who resented Lorenzo for demoting their family from a place of prominence in Florence. Their leader, Francesco de' Pazzi, was even imprisoned by Lorenzo for plotting against him. But in 1478, Lorenzo's brother, Giuliano, was stabbed to death by Pazzi family assassins, which led to a violent uprising in the streets of Florence. Although Lorenzo survived the attempt on his life, his brother's murder enraged him, and he exacted his revenge by having many Pazzi family members killed. Lorenzo ruled Florence for 28 years and made it the cultural capital of Europe. Like his father, Lorenzo enjoyed the finer things in life and surrounded himself with beautiful artwork, prized horses and exquisite wines from his vineyards across Tuscany. He famously owned 2 chariots and teams of horses that he kept groomed and ready to race around the streets of Florence. Lorenzo also continued his family's tradition of supporting scholars and artists. His personal library contained more than 1,200 manuscripts and included several ancient Greek texts. These manuscripts formed the core of the Medici collection that was later donated to the Laurentian Library, one of the oldest public libraries in Europe. However, Lorenzo wasn't so magnanimous with everyone. He fiercely protected his power and crushed anyone who threatened it. Most notably, he had the powerful Dominican friar Savonarola put to death for preaching against the corruption of the Medici. He also violently crushed several rebellions in his later years. Ultimately, his violent streak was overshadowed by his accomplishments and his love for the arts. Upon his death in 1492, the Medici firmly established as the most influential family in Florence and arguably all of Italy. But that's going to have to be it for this video, because in part 2, we'll see how the Medici continued to expand their influence and wealth into the 16th century, which resulted in the first Medici Pope, Leo X. If you'd like to help support the channel and get some awesome perks, then consider becoming a member. You can find that link in the description. I'll see you in part 2.